Ever had your entire life flipped upside down in a single day? That's exactly what happened when my HOA president decided to weaponize lies against me. The moment my wife began loading her car, Betty Stone, our HOA president, called the police. I stood frozen on the porch, watching the woman I loved prepare to leave, while Betty was busy spinning wild accusations. Illegal money schemes, domestic disturbance, financial fraud. His wife's finally escaping him, she declared with a venomous grin. After 6 months of bogus fines, intimidation, and threats to take our home, she believed she had destroyed me. And for a moment, it felt like she had my wife was actually leaving. But what Betty didn't know was where my wife worked. One call from her office would turn Betty's petty victory into a full-blown federal nightmare. Comment justice if you've ever wished karma would strike back hard. I'm Adam Miller, and my story begins with a secret I was desperately hiding from my wife, a secret that could have shattered our marriage if it ever came to light. Just 3 weeks earlier, I'd lost my job as a financial analyst. Bills were stacking up like autumn leaves, and Betty was circling like a vulture, offering me what she called a solution. Her house-buying proposal could wipe out our problems. But my shame kept me from telling Janet. Not while bank statements stuffed in my drawer painted a picture of shady money trails and late-night calls that made me look guilty of something I wasn't. To any outsider, it screamed deception. The doorbell interrupted my frantic cleanup as I shoved another pile of documents out of sight. Daniel, my older brother, stood there with his familiar worried expression, holding 2 cups of coffee. That look siblings give you when they know you're about to crash and burn. That's what Daniel wore. "Heard you're in trouble, Adam," he said, stepping in like he owned the place. "Why didn't you call family?" I wanted to come clean, but saying I'd been laid off felt like admitting I'd failed as a husband, as a man. So I muttered, "Didn't want anyone worrying yet." Still figuring things out, Daniel sat down, but his questions felt more like an interrogation than comfort. "How bad is it? Behind on the mortgage? What's the total debt?" His voice carried brotherly concern, but his precision unsettled me. It felt like he was cataloging every answer for later. I gave vague replies, embarrassed and cornered. An hour later, he drove off, leaving me with this gnawing sense that his concern had a hidden edge. Exactly 1 hour after Daniel's truck disappeared, Betty appeared on my doorstep, folder in hand, smile sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't waste time. "Adam, I know about your employment situation," she said confidently, flashing documents like a seasoned negotiator. $425,000 cash. No inspections. No delays. "I'll make this easy for you." My stomach dropped. How could she possibly know about my job loss? Only Daniel and Janet knew, unless Betty spoke casually about Janet's unpredictable government work and even mentioned our credit card struggles, details we'd never shared with anyone. It was like she'd been listening in on our private late-night talks. My blood ran cold. Had Daniel said something? Or was Betty pulling strings I couldn't yet see? Yet the whole exchange smelled of planning, not coincidence, like she had been waiting for that precise instant to strike. The more I turned it over later, the more convinced I became that someone had been passing Betty specifics about our weak spots, priming her for that exact confrontation. When Janet came home that evening, she found me hunched at the kitchen table with Betty's paperwork fanned out like evidence. "Adam, what is all this?" she asked, shrugging off her jacket and scanning the documents with immediate suspicion. I told her Betty had stopped by with a business offer, watching Janet's face move from curiosity to concern. She grabbed the purchase agreement and read it with an intense focus, peppering me with practical questions about terms and timing. Her review felt thorough normal, even but something about the way she dissected the numbers made me think she'd seen deals like this before. "Adam, these terms are predatory," she said after a few minutes of study. Why would you even consider this? I admitted we were under real financial strain and couldn't meet her eyes. The shame of hiding a total money collapse from my own wife ate at me. Owning up to the full scope of my failures felt impossible. What pressure? Janet pressed, adopting that prosecutorial cadence she used when she suspected someone of hiding things. On paper, my job looked stable. My severance should have stretched for months, and we had savings on hand. If only she knew those reserves had been spent liquidated to keep us afloat while I hunted for work. If only she understood I'd quietly sold things we owned to avoid admitting how desperate things had become. The conversation that followed is the kind that redefines a relationship in an hour, the kind that shows how fast trust can erode when communication breaks down. There are things about our finances you don't know, I confessed, feeling like I'd admitted a terrible betrayal of trust. Janet went stone still. Her expression shifted from worried partner to something precise and professional. What things, Adam? What aren't you telling me? The weight of my deception pressed down hard. The other option, saying I've been liquidating assets and hiding rejection emails while pretending everything was manageable, felt even worse. I've been handling some issues privately, trying to solve problems without worrying you, I muttered, knowing how pathetic that sounded even as the words left my mouth. The truth was my pride had blocked honest conversation. Now I was paying for trying to be the stoic provider when what our marriage needed was transparency and partnership. Each day, I delayed telling Janet made the eventual confession exponentially harder and more devastating. Janet's questioning sharpened into a systematic, probing inquiry that felt almost professional. Adam, have you discussed our finances with anyone outside this house? She asked, eyes fixed on my face. Just basic conversation with Daniel, I replied, but even that felt like too much now. With whom specifically, and what kind of basic conversation? Her intensity unsettled me, as if she'd been trained to detect lies and inconsistencies. Where had Janet learned to interrogate like this? Her government consulting work had always been vaguely described, but this level of interrogation suggested skills beyond routine corporate analysis. That night she worked late on her laptop, making calls I couldn't overhear, and I sat in our bedroom wondering how my life had become such a complicated mess. Every time I brought her coffee or tried to peek at what she was working on, she minimized windows and shifted topics. The distance between us grew by the hour, and I knew it was my fault for hiding the truth. Admitting everything felt like admitting complete failure as a husband and provider. When she finally closed the laptop and looked at me with those serious eyes, I knew the reckoning had come. Adam, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of an ultimatum. Tomorrow I'm investigating how Betty learned our private information, and I'm going to find out if my husband is telling the truth. That night I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, terrified by the simple, terrible question that rattled through my head. If I hadn't been the one telling Betty about our business, then who was? Someone had access to our most intimate conversations about money, stress, and family dynamics, someone feeding information to a woman who made a living exploiting vulnerable households. If it wasn't me leaking those secrets, then who the hell was betraying us from the inside? The morning after Janet's ultimatum delivered the confrontation I'd been dreading. At 6 a.m., I found her in the kitchen, phone in hand, scrolling through recent call logs and bank notifications I had thought I'd deleted. You know that hollow sinking feeling when you realize your partner has quietly been investigating your behavior? That's exactly what I felt as I shuffled downstairs for coffee and saw Janet poised like a strategist piecing together evidence. Adam, we need to talk about these deposits, she said without glancing away. $7,400 over 3 weeks. Where did this money come from? Her voice had that deadly calm people use when they plan to dismantle an explanation with facts and logic. Consulting projects, various things, I answered, knowing how thin and unconvincing it sounded. The truth was far more embarrassing than any lie I could invent. Confessing that I'd been draining assets to hide my failure felt impossible. What consulting specifically? Show me contracts, client names, invoices, Janet demanded, scrolling transaction records like a prosecutor building a case. The way she'd organized dates, amounts, and patterns made it clear she'd been tracking my activity longer than a single night. This wasn't a spontaneous suspicion. It was methodical surveillance by someone who knew how to construct evidence when they suspected deception. "Janet, why are you interrogating me like I'm a suspect?" I blurted, trying to deflect with righteous indignation, but she didn't back down. Her next line hit like a cold slap. "Because Betty Stone called me this morning with the exact amounts and dates of those deposits. Adam, she suggested they might come from questionable sources and told me to protect myself. Legally." Blood drained from my face. Someone had been feeding. Betty detailed intel about our private financial affairs information only reachable by someone with access to our banking records or to private conversations. The issue wasn't whether I'd done something criminal. It was who among us was betraying us. The rest of the morning blurred into a private unraveling. Janet's face shifted from suspicious wife to resolute decision-maker. "Adam, I can't stay while you're lying to me about money," she said, rising from the table with the slow, inexorable finality of someone who has already decided. I sat frozen under the kitchen light, feeling an ocean open between us. Morning memories, coffee on the porch, tired jokes, small rituals shattered like glass. I reached for words to close the gap, but my tongue failed, producing thin excuses that sounded false even to me. Janet gathered the papers with a calm that made them feel final. I tried one last plea to tell the whole truth and ask for a chance to rebuild, but the confession tasted like surrender and I stopped. Time, which once bonded us, now measured distance and did it painfully. I felt foolish and small as the house grew loud with the tick of the clock, aware with every second that trust, once broken, is a slow thing to mend and sometimes irreparable, and I understood the cost. Everything about that encounter felt staged, not accidental, like Betty had been handed a script and was waiting for the cue. The more I replayed it in my head, the more certain I became someone had been feeding her precise details about our vulnerabilities, grooming her for that exact pitch. When Janet got home that evening, she found me hunched at the kitchen table with Betty's paperwork spread out like damning evidence. "Adam, what is all this?" she asked, shrugging off her coat and scanning the pages with immediate suspicion. I said Betty had stopped by with a business offer, watching as Janet's face went from curiosity to concern. She picked up the agreement and read it with that razor focus she used on everything practical, exacting and unnervingly thorough. After a few minutes, she looked up. "These terms are predatory," she said. "Why would you even consider this?" I admitted we were under real pressure and could barely meet her gaze. The shame of hiding the full extent of our financial collapse from my wife ate at me. Admitting the whole truth felt impossible. Janet pressed harder, her voice taking on that no-nonsense cadence she used when she suspected someone of hiding something. On paper, my job and severance looked stable enough to last months, and we had savings. If only she knew those savings had already been spent liquidated to keep us afloat while I hunted for work. If only she knew I'd quietly sold belongings to mask how desperate things had become. That hour-long conversation stripped away small comforts and revealed how quickly trust can crumble when honesty is missing. "There are things about our finances you don't know," I confessed, the words like a stone falling in my chest. Janet went deadly quiet. It was like seeing a partner switch into investigator mode. "What things, Adam? What aren't you telling me?" she asked. The weight of my deception pressed on me. Admitting I'd been selling off assets and hiding rejection emails felt like denouncing myself. Her questioning shifted into something clinical, methodical, and probing. Have you discussed this with anyone else? She asked, eyes locked on mine. Just basic talk with Daniel, I answered, but even that felt too much now. With whom specifically, and what did you tell them? The intensity unnerved me. Janet's consulting work had always been described vaguely, but this felt like professional interrogation. That night she stayed up late on her laptop, making calls and digging in ways I couldn't see. I wandered the bedroom, watching her minimize windows whenever I walked by. Distance grew between us by the hour, and I knew it was my fault for hiding things. Telling her had been the only honest option, but pride had choked it off. When she finally looked up, exhausted but resolute, I knew a reckoning had arrived. Tomorrow I'll find out how Betty learned our private information, she said softly. And I'm going to see if my husband is telling the truth. Lying awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind kept spinning. If I hadn't told Betty, who had? Someone knew our most private talks about money and fear, and that someone had fed those details to a woman who preyed on families in crisis. The question that kept me awake was simple and terrible. Who was betraying us from the inside? Morning came with the confrontation I dreaded. At 6 a.m., Janet sat at the kitchen counter with her phone, scrolling through call logs and account alerts I thought I'd erased. That hollow sinking feeling hit me hard. She'd been quietly building a case. Adam, we need to talk about these deposits, she said without looking up. $7,400 over 3 weeks. Where did that come from? Her voice had the cold precision of someone dismantling an alibi. Consulting projects, I mumbled, the explanation thin as tissue. The truth admitting I'd been draining accounts to hide failure felt impossible. Which consulting? Show me contracts, clients' invoices, Janet demanded, scrolling through bank records like a prosecutor. Her organization dates, amounts, patterns made it clear she'd been tracking this for longer than a single night. This wasn't a fleeting suspicion. It was methodical scrutiny by someone who knew how to build a case. Why are you interrogating me like I'm a suspect? I snapped, half angry, half terrified. But she didn't relent. Then she dropped the bomb. Betty Stone called me this morning with the exact amounts and dates of those deposits. She suggested they might come from questionable sources and told me to protect myself legally. My blood ran cold. Someone had been relaying detailed intel about our private finances information only available to someone with access to our records or private conversations. It wasn't just about whether I'd done anything illegal. It was about who had betrayed us. The rest of the morning blurred into a private collapse. Janet's face moved from wounded spouse to someone already deciding. Adam, I can't stay while you lied to me about money, she announced, standing with the slow finality of someone who'd made up her mind. I sat there under the kitchen light, clumsy and empty-handed, watching the life we built fracture. I tried to speak, to offer the whole truth and ask for a chance to repair us, but the words tasted like surrender. She gathered the papers with calm finality. The house echoed with the tick of the clock, and with each passing second it felt increasingly clear. Trust, once broken, is a long thing to repair, sometimes impossible. Everything about Janet's quick, thorough digging felt like something more than worried curiosity. So she's been buying properties from families in crisis? I asked, trying to make sense of what Janet's findings meant for us. All from households hit by divorce, medical bills, or job loss, she corrected, with the clinical precision of someone who'd already analyzed the data. Betty's pattern, Janet said, was obvious. Target families at their weakest, then offer a below-market rescue that looks like salvation. The way Janet described the scheme sounded less like neighborhood gossip and more like professional profiling. Alone in the empty house after our call, a dozen unsettling facts kept surfacing. Janet's research skills were sharper than I'd realized. Betty's access to our private finances suggested an insider feeding her details. Daniel's questions at the police visit had centered on procedure, not comfort. A neighbor had been watching our comings and goings closely enough to note odd visitors. The pieces fit together into a picture far darker than I'd expected. The nagging question that wouldn't leave me was this: how had Janet pulled together property records, sale histories, and crisis timelines so quickly? Her work looked like that of a trained investigator, not a curious spouse. And if Janet had hidden investigative skills, what else about her past had I never known? At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a security alert. Motion detected. My stomach dropped. Someone had been inside our house. I stared at the footage and felt the world tilt. This wasn't a smash and grab. Someone moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who belonged there, opening drawers, photographing documents, avoiding the main cameras. The intruder wore a dark hoodie, face hidden, but their route through the house showed intimate familiarity with our layout and where we kept sensitive papers. Watching it made my skin crawl. It was like watching a silent guest steal everything private about us. There were no forced entries, no broken locks, no smashed windows. The intruder had used a key. The spare was hidden in a fake rock in the garden, a spot only family and trusted contacts knew. The realization hit like a punch. This break-in was an inside job. Someone we trusted had given access, or someone had copied our key. I called Janet immediately and tried not to sound deranged. "Someone was in the house," I said. They had our keys and knew where to find the financial files. Her response was immediate and procedural. "Show me the footage. Make a list of everyone with key access." She sounded like someone briefing a security team, not a shocked spouse. That evening Betty called instead of showing up. Her tone was clipped and businesslike as she read off a list of alleged HOA violations: lawn neglect $1,200, illegal parking $800, boundary infractions $1,500 total due now, interest compounding daily. "These require immediate attention," she insisted. I stared at the citations, amazed at how specific they were for conditions we hadn't violated. Our lawn was fine, our parking legal, our boundaries unchanged. Still, she quoted neighbor testimony and photographic evidence as if her decisions were final. The timing was no accident. The fines were engineered to push us into a corner, make her lowball offer seem like the only escape. $3,500 in immediate penalties, daily interest, the looming cost of appeals, and the pressure of my unemployment. Betty's arithmetic was simple and merciless. Create enough stress and the homeowner will accept a bad deal to be rid of the squeeze. "My cash offer is still on the table," Betty said with the bland sympathy of a predator. "Act now, or these charges will keep growing." Her voice was the voice of someone who'd thought this through from the start, a calculated plan that treated families like collateral. But the speed and thoroughness of Janet's work made me uneasy in a way I couldn't name. "So she's buying up properties from families in crisis?" I asked, trying to process what Janet's findings meant. "Yes, houses from people dealing with divorce, medical bills, or job loss," she corrected, clinical and exact. Betty wasn't just opportunistic. She targeted families at their weakest moments, then offered a quick, below-market out that looked like salvation. Janet described the pattern with the kind of professional detachment you'd expect from someone used to spotting predatory tactics. Left alone in the quiet house, a dozen disturbing facts circled my head. Janet's research was sharper than I'd ever realized. Betty seemed to know private details about our finances that only someone inside the family could have shared. Daniel's questions at the police station had felt more like an information-gathering briefing than brotherly concern. A neighbor had watched our comings and goings closely enough to corroborate odd visitors. The pieces fit into a picture much darker than random coincidence. The nagging question that wouldn't let me sleep was simple and terrifying. How had Janet pulled up property records, sales histories, and crisis correlations so fast? Her work smelled like professional investigation, not the desperate fact-checking of a worried spouse. If Janet had training I never knew about, what else about her past had gone unasked? Then the security alert hit at 2:47 p.m., motion detected in the house. My stomach dropped. I pulled up the footage and felt like the floor had fallen away. This wasn't a smash and grab. The person moved through rooms with the ease of someone who belonged there, opening drawers, photographing documents, and avoiding the main cameras. They wore a dark hoodie and kept their face hidden, but their route through the house betrayed intimate knowledge of where we stored sensitive papers. Watching it felt like watching a ghost rummage through our life. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows. Whoever had been inside used a key. The spare key was hidden in a fake rock in the garden, something only family and trusted emergency contacts knew. The conclusion slammed me. This was an inside job. Either someone had copied our key or someone we trusted had given access. I called Janet and tried to keep my voice steady. Someone was in the house, I said. They used a key and knew where the documents were. Her response was immediate and procedural. Show me the footage. Make a list of everyone with key access. She sounded like she was briefing a security team, not like a shocked partner. That night Betty phoned instead of showing up. Her tone was businesslike as she read a list of alleged HOA violations. Lawn neglect $1,200, illegal parking $800, boundary infractions $1,500, all due immediately with daily interest. I stared at the citations in disbelief. These weren't minor infractions, and many were plainly false. Our lawn was maintained, our parking was within rules, and our boundaries were unchanged. Still, Betty claimed neighbor testimony and photographic proof like her rulings were indisputable. The timing was obvious. Squeeze them financially and the investor's below-market offer starts to look appealing. $3,500 in immediate penalties, compounded daily, the cost of fighting phony charges, and the pressure of my unemployment. Betty's math was simple and brutal. Create enough pain and people look for any way out. My cash offer stands, she said with indulgent sympathy. Act now, or these fines keep growing. It was the voice of a predator who'd already thought this through, a plan that treated families as collateral. Each false version of the story was designed to pull a different reaction out of whoever leaked to Betty, a baited trap disguised as family gossip. We had to be surgical. Every suspect received their own unique fictional detail, carefully segregated so nothing crossed streams and ruined the experiment. Sunday afternoon, I mentioned Janet's inheritance in a casual chat with Daniel, $50,000. I said, exhaling with the relief we wanted him to show. He sounded genuinely pleased at first, but then his question switched from congratulatory to precise. When would the money land? How soon could we access it? Had it already cleared? His curiosity felt clinical, like someone taking notes rather than celebrating a family windfall. Monday morning brought the payoff, the evidence that our counterintelligence had worked. Betty phoned asking for an emergency meeting and opened with the confident tone of someone reading a detailed briefing. I hear Janet inherited a large sum, she said. Now your situation looks different. Let's talk about expanding our arrangement. The inheritance story had only been shared with Daniel, which meant the leak could only come from him. After I hung up, I told Janet flatly, your brother-in-law has been selling our family secrets to Betty. Her reaction wasn't shock so much as grim confirmation, like a scientist whose hypothesis had just been proven. It's Daniel, she said, already pulling up the timeline she'd built. Janet's files showed it wasn't a one-off. His betrayal had been methodical and long-running, roughly 6 months of intelligence gathering, payments wired regularly. and meticulous notes correlating our private conversations with Betty's increasing knowledge. The documents laid out a pattern. Daniel's visits matched spikes in Betty's information. Payments appeared on dates that lined up with fresh gossip. His questions always targeted timing and amounts, not the kind of empathy you'd expect from family. He hadn't been casually repeating household chatter. He had been running a surveillance operation. Discovering that my own brother had been cataloging our private struggles and selling them to a predator was more brutal than anything Betty herself had done. Betrayal from family cuts far deeper than an outside con. That hollow feeling when you realize someone entrusted with your secrets weaponized them against you is a sick punch to the gut, and that's exactly what hit me as the full scale of Daniel's deception came into focus. "How long?" I asked, though part of me feared the answer. 6 months, Janet replied with clinical calm. He's been feeding her before our problems became severe enough to make us targets. Even with Daniel exposed, my own dishonesty still hung heavy. Janet confronted me on the deposit she'd found, the sums I'd tried to explain away. Identifying the leak didn't excuse my secrecy. "Adam, you're still withholding financial information," she said, voice hard with exhaustion. I tried to explain I'd been protecting her from panic, but the excuse sounded pitiful in the face of the evidence. Pride had kept me silent, and now that silence was poisoning our marriage. Janet moved past shock to strategy. "He comes for dinner tomorrow," she said, voice flat, the planner replacing the wife. "We confront him with the evidence, record his response, and give him the choice: cooperate in exposing Betty or face public exposure." Her approach felt like a professional interrogation plan, not a family intervention. She prepared surveillance clips, bank records showing payments to Daniel, a timeline mapping his visits against Betty's intelligence spikes, and audio of his questioning during earlier visits, everything needed to force a confession or capture deception in real time. If he admitted it and agreed to help unravel Betty's scheme, maybe family could be repaired. If not, exposure was inevitable. The stakes were enormous. Relationships possibly ruined, reputations shredded, and a predator's pipeline cut off. Tuesday evening arrived thick with tension. Daniel arrived for dinner unaware he was walking into a room stacked with proof of his systematic betrayal. "Adam, how are you handling the inheritance story?" Daniel asked within minutes of sitting down, immediately proving our little counterintelligence ploy had hit the mark. Janet flipped on the recorder we'd set up to capture whatever came next, and I braced myself for the wrenching task of confronting my own brother about betraying our family's trust. "Daniel," Janet said with the composed authority of someone used to hostile interviews, "we need to talk about your relationship with Betty Stone, the payments she's been making to you, and the deliberate intelligence operation you've run on our family for the last 6 months. Color drained from his face when he realized we'd traced Betty's inside information straight back to him. The moment of truth was upon us. There was no longer any pretense of casual concern. Tomorrow would force either his full confession and cooperation, or the end of our family ties in the name of protecting ourselves. That dinner that would break my relationship with my brother began with Daniel sitting at our kitchen table, wholly unaware that we'd spent the prior day assembling the case to confront him. Janet had spread folders across the table like evidence, records, notes, timelines linking his visits to Betty with her increasing knowledge of our private affairs. You know that hollow dread when you're about to accuse someone you love of a grievous betrayal? That's what knotted my stomach as Daniel chatted about the weather, then casually named money details he couldn't possibly have known, proof he'd been involved long before we revealed anything. "We need to talk about what you just said," Janet said in the flat, controlled tone of someone who's handled deception before. He flushed, tried to laugh it off, but the laugh sounded brittle. Janet slid a folder toward him, the pages showing his visits aligned with Betty's sudden knowledge of our finances. His mask of loyalty began to crumble. "What exactly are you implying?" he managed weakly. The words had no strength. Janet started the recording and methodically presented the evidence, each fact a tighter knot in the net. "Each of your visits corresponds with Betty's newfound knowledge about our family," she said, pointing to the documentation that made the case undeniable. Her files showed payments, $8,500 across 6 months for targeted intel on our pressures, vulnerabilities, and private conversations. The way Janet revealed each piece left no room to wiggle or explain it away. I was too stunned watching my brother's defenses fail to question how expertly she handled the interrogation. When Daniel finally spoke, his words landed like a blow. "Adam, my contracting business has been collapsing for 2 years, he confessed, voice cracking under the weight of admitting how he'd betrayed us. "I'm barely staying afloat. Seeing you with a steady job, a lovely wife, and a stable home. I was desperate." He explained that when Betty offered money for neighborhood gossip about families in trouble, he took it as a way to survive. The knowledge that jealousy and resentment, not coercion, had driven him made the betrayal sting deeper than if he'd been forced into it. Janet asked with cold clarity, "How much did she pay you to destroy your family?" His answer was barely audible, $8,500 in total over 6 months. "What began as casual neighborhood chatter," he said, "escalated into specific targeting of our situation once Betty marked us as ripe for acquisition." The methodical slide from idle disloyalty to organized surveillance was horrifying in its deliberate cruelty. Janet's next revelation hit like a sledgehammer. "Daniel, you helped Betty target a dozen families over the last 3 years, she said, showing reports that documented his wider role. The scope of his operation went far beyond our household. Information he supplied had helped people lose homes during medical crises, bankrupt families dealing with emergencies, and coerce others into fire sale deals during relationship breakdowns. She read victim statements. Mrs. Clark's home lost while her husband battled cancer because Daniel fed Betty their financial strain. The Martinez family pressured to sell while their daughter recovered from surgery because someone shared their vulnerability. Hearing the names of neighbors we knew and cared about crushed me. Mrs. Clark, a woman we'd seen daily, had been among the families Daniel had helped destroy. He looked stricken, shame collapsing his face into something almost human. But the 6-month pattern of betrayal made it impossible to tell if remorse was real or an act to soften consequences. Daniel's treachery exposed and documented. I had to confess my own failures, the hiding, the secrecy, the bank deposits that made me look like the conspirator Betty portrayed. "Janet, about those deposits you found, the meetings, everything that made me seem like I was colluding with Betty," I said, leading her to the garage where I'd stashed proof of my desperate efforts. I'd sold anything of value, my watch, whatever jewelry we could spare borrowed against retirement, even pawned a family heirloom. I'd taken cash advances to cover mortgage payments and daily expenses. All of it was an ugly scramble to keep us afloat without confessing failure. Janet read the document slowly, comprehension and sorrow mixing on her face as she realized how pride and shame had driven me to hide the truth instead of asking for help. "Adam, how are you handling that inheritance?" Daniel asked within minutes of sitting down, instantly proving our counterintelligence trick had landed. Janet hit the recorder we'd set up to capture his reaction, and I braced myself to confront the gutting reality of accusing my own brother of betraying our family. With the calm authority of someone used to hostile interviews, Janet said, "We need to discuss your connection to Betty Stone, the money she's been sending you, and the intelligence operation you've run on our family for the last 6 months." Color drained from Daniel's face the second he understood we'd traced Betty's inside knowledge back to him. There was no longer any pretense of casual concern, only an unavoidable reckoning. Tomorrow would force either his full confession and cooperation, or the irrevocable collapse of the family ties meant to protect us. Dinner started like any other, but we had spent the prior day assembling every scrap of proof. Janet laid out folders across the table, records, notes, timelines linking his visits to Betty with her growing awareness of our private affairs. That sick, hollow dread you feel before accusing someone you love of a grievous betrayal settled in my gut as Daniel chattered about small things and then casually named specifics about our finances he could not possibly have known. "We need to talk about what you just said," Janet said in that flat, controlled tone of someone who's handled deception before. His attempt to laugh it off sounded brittle. Janet pushed a folder toward him, pages showing his visits aligned with Betty's sudden knowledge. His mask of loyalty began to crumble. "What are you implying?" he asked weakly. Janet turned on the recorder and methodically presented the evidence, tightening the noose with each carefully placed fact. "Each time you visited correlates with Betty's newfound insight about our family," she said, pointing to notes that made denial impossible. Her files showed payments, $8,500 over 6 months for targeted intel, our pressures, vulnerabilities, and private conversations. The way she released each piece left no room for an easy escape. I watched my brother's defenses collapse and barely noticed where Janet had learned such interrogation. Finesse. When Daniel finally confessed, it landed like a blow. "Adam, my contracting business has been failing for 2 years, he said, voice breaking as guilt and shame collided. "I was desperate. Seeing you with steady work and a stable life made me jealous." He admitted that when Betty offered payment for neighborhood tips, he took it. What began as idle gossip escalated into specific targeting of our situation once Betty flagged us as vulnerable. Janet's cold question cut through any excuse. "How much did she pay you to betray your family?" $8,500 total, he whispered. The progression from casual disloyalty to systematic family surveillance was horrifying in its deliberate cruelty. Then Janet delivered the worst reveal. "Daniel hadn't limited himself to us. You helped Betty target a dozen families over the last 3 years, she said, producing documentation that detailed a wider campaign. The information he supplied contributed to people losing homes when struck by illness, financial shocks, or relationship breakdowns. She read victim statements. Mrs. Clark lost her home while her husband fought cancer because someone reported their hardship. The Martinez family were pressured into a fire sale while their daughter recovered from surgery because someone disclosed their vulnerability. Hearing the names of neighbors we knew gutted me. Mrs. Clark had been one of the victims. Daniel's face folded with something like remorse, yet the systematic 6-month pattern made it impossible to tell whether his contrition was real or staged to lessen the fallout. With Daniel's treachery exposed, I had to own up to my own deception, the deposits, the secret meetings, the behavior that made me look complicit with Betty. "Janet, about those deposits you found," I said, leading her to the garage where I'd stashed evidence of my desperate measures. I had sold cherished items, borrowed against retirement, pawned family jewelry, and taken cash advances to cover the mortgage and bills. The documents showed how pride and shame had driven me to hide the truth rather than ask for help. Janet read through everything slowly. Comprehension and sorrow crossed her face as she absorbed how badly I'd mishandled our crisis. Just as we were processing everything, Detective Martinez arrived accompanied by a federal prosecutor, and the gravity of the situation shifted from neighborhood scandal to federal investigation. "This appears to be an interstate wire fraud operation affecting multiple counties," the prosecutor explained. "We have preliminary authorizations for search warrants. Potential charges include wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and organized criminal enterprise." The predatory, systematic nature of Betty's scheme had reached thresholds that triggered federal interest, and Daniel's cooperation suddenly had legal value beyond protecting our family. The prosecutor explained the stakes plainly. Full cooperation might reduce exposure. Refusal could mean long federal sentences. Daniel's face went ashen as he realized his betrayal made him an accessory to federal crimes. Daniel agreed to cooperate almost immediately, voice trembling with the recognition of the consequences he'd unleashed. He promised to help the families he'd harmed, including Mrs. Clark. The prosecutor outlined what cooperation would require: wearing recording devices, providing detailed testimony about Betty's methods and collaborators, and identifying other victims who might not yet know they'd been targeted. The plan was surgical. Daniel would call Betty the next morning, pretending we'd accepted her buyout. Federal agents would monitor and record the conversation, giving prosecutors the evidence they needed. Janet's calm confidence suggested she'd coordinated with official channels before her manner was that of someone used to working with law enforcement, not merely a wrong neighbor. As Daniel agreed to the setup, it hit me. Our family crisis was about to become the backbone of a federal case dismantling a predatory enterprise that had preyed on dozens of households. The woman who'd thought she was cornering an unemployed analyst and a stressed consultant had actually picked victims with tools and resources she'd badly underestimated. Tomorrow could end with Betty's confession and arrest, or reveal that we'd miscalculated. The irony stung. Daniel's betrayal delivered Betty into the hands of people far more capable of dismantling her network than she'd imagined. The next morning, Daniel sat at our kitchen table wearing a federal recording device. Watching him dial felt like watching someone tumble into a trap they'd helped construct. "Betty, it's Daniel," he said, voice tight. Adam and Janet agreed to accept. The inheritance solved everything. Betty's reply, captured perfectly, was chilling in its matter-of-fact cruelty. Praise for his surveillance, a promise of a $26,500 bonus, and talk of future targets. She discussed the operation like a business model: identify vulnerability windows, apply pressure across channels, and offer an exit that benefits the predator. When Daniel extracted confirmation of scope, "How many families?" she said with proud detachment. 12 over 3 years in this county. The systematic reach was worse than we'd feared. 2 hours later, Betty arrived at our door, confident she was closing another deal. But this time the deal was a setup. The net we'd woven, Janet's analysis, Daniel's recordings, and federal backup was ready to snap. She had no idea federal agents were scattered through the neighborhood, or that the consultant she thought she'd been exploiting actually oversaw organized fraud prosecutions. "Adam, Janet, I'm glad you've come to your senses," Betty announced, settling into our living room with the practiced authority of someone who'd closed this conversation dozens of times with families she'd already squeezed. "We don't have any other options," I said, following the script Janet and I had rehearsed to draw her out. "Financial pressure makes your cash offer look like salvation," I added. Betty nodded with that oily sympathy that barely hid her pleasure. "Federal investigations create the exact pressure that forces families into quick deals," she said, not knowing that her offhand explanation would become the smoking gun in her own prosecution. Janet had been quiet while Betty laid out her predatory playbook. Then she spoke, her voice calm and precise, the same authority she'd used while we planned our counterintelligence. "Betty, there's something you should know about my so-called federal problems," she said, reaching into her briefcase with controlled deliberation. Her face changed as she withdrew credentials I'd never seen in our marriage. "I preside over federal criminal proceedings," she said slowly. "Federal Magistrate Judge Janet Miller, jurisdiction over organized fraud cases, authorized to issue warrants, oversee preliminary hearings, and supervise criminal complaints." The room went utterly still. Betty stared at the badge like it was a live grenade, her composure cracking as the realization hit. She'd been running a criminal enterprise against someone whose work was built to tear operations like hers apart. Betty tried to recover, to stand, to escape the trap she'd walked into. But Detective Martinez and federal agents stepped in through the front door. The quiet show of force making it plain this was far from a neighborhood squabble. "Betty Stone, you're under federal arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy, mail fraud, and operating an organized criminal enterprise," Martinez announced, voice even and professional, holding up the arrest authority that had been months in the making. He recited the charge that had finally caught up to her: systematic exploitation of a dozen families using insider intelligence networks. Betty's protests rang hollow. "Daniel was my source," she blurted, trying to shift blame. Martinez let a small, controlled smile cross his face. "Daniel Miller has been cooperating with federal law enforcement for 48 hours, he said. "Every conversation you've had with him since Tuesday evening has been recorded. Your confession is documented." The irony crashed into the room like a tidal wave. Betty had hired my brother to spy on his own family, paid him thousands to chronicle our vulnerabilities and private conversations, and used that intelligence to squeeze people in crisis. But that same intelligence trail had delivered her straight into a federal prosecutor's hands, and into the lap of the very kind of authority she'd been trying to avoid. "You recruited my brother to betray us," Janet said, measured satisfaction undercutting the pain. "But that family included a federal magistrate judge whose job is to authorize warrants for operations just like yours." As agents clipped on handcuffs, Betty glared at Daniel, hatred raw in her eyes. "You promised easy targets," she hissed. Daniel met her stare with something steadier than fear, the resolve of a man finally trying to make amends. Across the neighborhood, federal teams executed coordinated actions. Financial records seized from Betty's office, property transfer documents pulled for evidence, victims contacted about restitution. The scope of her operation turned out to be larger than we'd imagined. Multi-county exploitation during medical crises, relationship breakdowns, and job losses, enough to trigger expanded federal jurisdiction. Janet watched the scene with judicial restraint. She already knew she would have to recuse herself because of her personal involvement. "This will require warrant authorizations and preliminary proceedings before trial," she told Martinez, voice cool and procedural. Betty's own recorded admissions about methods, collaborators, and the targeting scheme provided the backbone for a case that could dismantle the entire network. As federal agents led her away and officers canvassed the area for evidence, the monstrous clarity of what had happened settled over us. A predator who thought she could prey on desperate neighbors had underestimated the reach and resolve of the people she targeted and had walked straight into a net set by professionals who turned her own tactics against her. Have you ever wondered what happens when corruption finally collides with real justice? The way Janet discussed prosecution with Martinez confirmed everything I'd feared during our crisis. My wife's so-called government consulting job had always been federal law enforcement in disguise. Her calm, methodical approach to our nightmare wasn't luck, it was professional training. As agents wrapped up evidence and prepared victim notifications, Janet turned to me with a look that blended pride with regret. "Adam," she said, voice steady, "I've been a federal magistrate judge for 15 years. Suddenly, her years of secrecy about classified consulting made sense. She couldn't reveal her role until Betty's scheme collapsed. All her calculated moves, the interrogations, the planning, the legal precision clicked into place. Ironically, when Daniel helped Betty target us, he unknowingly delivered a federal judge straight into their operation. The same tactics Betty used to break families became the trap that ended her empire. Federal agents processed Betty, while Martinez and Janet outlined timelines for prosecution and restitution. Tomorrow would bring charges, asset seizures, and justice for every victimized family. That night, I realized our pain had become a weapon against predatory power. 3 months later, in a packed courtroom, victims shared stories of sleepless nights and shattered trust. Judge Patterson, stern and unshakable, declared Betty's actions reprehensible. 10 years in federal prison, $185,000 restitution, permanent ban from HOA or real estate, he ordered, crushing her false authority in one ruling. Betty sat broken in her orange jumpsuit, no longer the smug queen of Riverside Heights. Families wept as restitution returned stolen homes and repaid debts. Mrs. Clark, who lost her house while caring for her dying husband, cried with relief after reclaiming stability and dignity. Even Daniel, sentenced to 18 months, admitted his betrayal and worked directly with victims, helping rebuild lives he once helped destroy. Our community transformed almost overnight. Emergency elections replaced Betty's puppets with honest leaders. Audits exposed stolen funds, restitution rebuilt trust, and property values soared 30%. Janet used her expertise to launch an HOA fraud prevention clinic, offering free legal guidance to vulnerable families and rapid response teams to block predatory scams. Our marriage, once fractured by suspicion and hidden truths, healed through painful but necessary honesty. Janet confessed she'd once doubted me, and I admitted my prideful silence about financial collapse. That mutual apology became the seed of stronger trust. 6 months later, children laughed freely in yards once shadowed by Betty's threats, and neighbors worked together without fear. What began as one family's crisis grew into a movement for transparency, justice, and protection. And here's where you come in. What's the worst HOA horror you've witnessed? Drop your story in the comments. It might be the spark for the next case that protects countless families. And don't forget, subscribe to Litton HOA Stories so you never miss the battles, the victories, and the justice that follows when good people refuse to stay silent. Have you ever seen a community rise stronger from the very people who tried to break it? What once was intimidation and fear under Betty's HOA reign transformed into genuine cooperation, thanks to a permanent legal shield Janet built for every family. Even Daniel, whose betrayal ran deep, worked tirelessly after his release, helping victims, rebuilding trust, and even being hired by neighbors he had once helped exploit. He admitted over dinner, "I can't erase 6 months of surveillance, but maybe helping families recover gives me a small piece of redemption." His sincerity marked a fragile, but real step toward forgiveness. Meanwhile, Janet's Neighborhood Protection Fund grew into a powerful safeguard monthly contributions funding lawyers, rapid response teams, and education programs that taught families how to spot predatory tactics before they escalated into crisis. Within a year, Riverside Heights had become more than a neighborhood. It became a model for resisting organized fraud. 15 communities attended our first property fraud prevention conference, learning how predators thrive by isolating victims and how unity destroys their power. Soon, 5 nearby neighborhoods adopted our exact protocols, and a regional task force began tracking predatory HOA-style schemes. Walking our streets a year later, I watched children play freely where Betty once issued bogus violations to push families out, and I felt it. Our nightmare had evolved into a shield protecting families we would never even meet. Our crisis, once deeply personal, had built a defense system stronger than Betty's greed ever imagined. And that's why we keep telling these stories, because your HOA nightmare might be the next case that sparks change for thousands. So tell me in the comments, what's your worst HOA experience? Your story could be the spark for justice. And make sure to subscribe to Litton HOA Stories, because together, we're proving that no corrupt system can outlast a united community. This crisis taught me something I'll never forget. Honesty may feel risky, but real transparency builds stronger bonds than secrets ever could. Janet reminded me during one of our late-night talks. Financial struggles aren't shame. They're just challenges we're meant to face together. My own growth meant admitting that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Even Daniel's road to redemption went further than any court order. Beyond his sentence, he worked with victims he'd once betrayed, so much so that 3 families he had spied on actually hired him later for real home improvement projects. Over dinner, he admitted with tears in his eyes, "I'll never erase the guilt of those 6 months, but maybe consistent service can prove I've truly changed." Meanwhile, Riverside Heights became a model of democratic governance. Property values rose 40% as families flocked to live in a neighborhood known for protection instead of exploitation. Janet's nonprofit clinic expanded across the region, teaching families how to spot predatory HOA patterns, offering free legal help, and shutting down fraud before it took root. Our one-time nightmare had transformed into laws, safeguards, and a statewide movement for HOA transparency. Even national real estate publications highlighted our story as proof that residents can defeat corruption. At our annual fraud prevention conference, Janet stood before hundreds of leaders and prosecutors, warning, "Predators evolve fast, but so can we if we unite." Daniel, too, found his path turning victim support into an honest business. Proving redemption isn't a single act but a lifetime of rebuilding trust. The greatest irony? His betrayal led Betty straight into the hands of a federal magistrate judge, my wife. And Betty, once feared, now serves a decade behind bars while the neighborhood she tried to destroy is in her absence. Our journey proved one thing: predators thrive on isolation, but community destroys their power. So I'll ask you, have you ever seen corruption in your neighborhood that felt impossible to resist? Share your story below, because awareness is the first defense, and your experience might protect someone else. Betty's handcuffs were our ending, but our beginning was democratic freedom, justice, and community stronger than fear. And if this left you speechless, subscribe now, because the next HOA story will shake you even harder.